we're heading to Portland, Oregon today. After a week away for work in the glittering fashion capital, I expected to return to the quiet sanctuary I had built for myself. My name is Quinn. I am 32 years old and I work as a creative director in the rainy city of Portland. I stepped out of the taxi into the pouring rain, dragging my Rimowa suitcase that still carried the luggage tags from Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport, but my excitement vanished instantly. A rusted pickup truck was parked aggressively on my manicured lawn next to a mountain of leaking black trash bags that were destroying the landscaping I paid thousands to maintain. I pushed open the front door only to be gagged by a suffocating wave of stale cigarette smoke mixed with the nauseating scent of grease and rotting food. The horror intensified when I saw that my custom Italian furniture had been carelessly shoved against the walls to make space for 3 hideous stained armchairs that looked like they belonged in a landfill. My parents and my older sister, who has never been able to hold a job for more than 3 months anywhere, suddenly emerged from the kitchen wearing triumphant smiles as if they were the lords of the manor instead of intruders. My sister stepped forward while wearing my favorite silk robe and screamed, "Surprise, this is for you," as if destroying my home was a generous gift. I felt a cold rage settle in my chest as I looked at the people who were supposed to be my family, but were actually parasites. I stared at them with zero emotion and replied, "Tomorrow I'll give all of you an even bigger surprise." Please subscribe to my channel right now to witness how I evicted these toxic intruders and took back my life. The next morning, I woke up in my locked bedroom, the silence of the house masking the storm that was about to break. I forced myself to get out of bed because avoiding the reality downstairs would not make the intruders disappear or fix the disaster they had created. My throat felt parched from the stress of the previous night, so I unlocked my door and descended the staircase to find a glass of water in the kitchen. The familiar layout of my home felt alien and hostile as I navigated past piles of unfamiliar clutter that had appeared overnight in the hallway. When I stepped into the open-concept kitchen that used to be my pride and joy, I froze in absolute disbelief at the scene unfolding before my eyes. Roxanne was standing by the stove, flipping strips of bacon in a frying pan, while grease splattered violently in every direction, including onto her chest. My breath hitched when I realized she was wearing my limited edition champagne silk blouse that I had purchased from a boutique in Milan just last season. Dark spots of hot oil were already soaking into the delicate fabric that was never meant to be near a kitchen, let alone a frying pan. I could not control the volume of my voice as I screamed at her to take it off immediately because she was ruining a garment worth more than her entire wardrobe. Roxanne simply glanced over her shoulder with a dismissive smirk and shrugged, as if I were overreacting to a trivial accident. She turned back to the bacon and said, "It's just a shirt, Quinn. Since you have so much money, you should share with your family." Her audacity struck me harder than a physical blow because she genuinely believed she was entitled to destroy my property simply because we shared DNA. I looked over at the dining table where my mother Margaret was sitting like a queen, awaiting her subjects to serve her breakfast. She tapped her manicured fingernails impatiently against the wooden surface and completely ignored my distress over the ruined silk blouse. Margaret looked me up and down with critical eyes before ordering me to finish cooking the eggs because a dutiful daughter should never be lazy or let her parents go hungry in her own home. They were treating me like a servant in the house I paid for, while acting as if they were the benevolent owners allowing me to stay. I realized in that moment that arguing with them using logic or emotion would be a complete waste of my energy because they lacked the capacity for shame. I turned on my heel without saying another word and marched back upstairs to my home office, where I kept my most important documents safe. I retrieved the thick file containing the property deed, the mortgage statements paid entirely from my bank account, and the utility bills bearing only my name. I returned to the kitchen with the heavy stack of paperwork in my hands and slammed it down onto the dining table with enough force to make the wood groan. The sudden impact caused coffee to slosh out of my father's mug and stain the tablecloth, but I did not care about the mess anymore. My father, Victor, jumped in his seat and looked at me with wide eyes, while Margaret finally stopped tapping her fingers to stare at the pile. Before they could ask what I was doing or scold me for my rudeness, the digital clock on the microwave clicked over to exactly 9 o'clock. The front doorbell rang precisely on cue, cutting through the tension that hung thick in the air like smoke. I walked to the front door and opened it to reveal my lawyer, Jessica, who stood there looking immaculate in a sharp charcoal suit. Jessica did not smile or offer any pleasantries because she knew exactly why she had been summoned so early on a weekday morning. She walked past me into the dining area and placed a single sheet of paper titled "Notice to Quit" directly on top of my stack of ownership documents. My family stared at the stranger in confusion until Jessica began to speak with a voice that was calm yet terrifyingly authoritative. She explained that their presence in this house constituted unauthorized occupancy and that I had formally retained her legal services to remove them. Jessica locked eyes with my father and delivered the ultimatum we had prepared. You have exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises, or the sheriff will be involved. The silence that followed her declaration was deafening, as the reality of the situation finally began to sink into their minds. My parents looked from the legal documents to my stone-cold expression and realized that the submissive daughter they once manipulated no longer existed. Standing there with my arms crossed over my chest, I watched the color drain from their faces and felt the first flicker of genuine power I had experienced since they arrived. This was not a negotiation or a family squabble. It was an eviction, and I was ready to see it through to the bitter end. 2 days later, the atmosphere in the house had turned from chaotic to dangerously toxic, forcing me to stay on high alert. The tension was no longer a silent undercurrent, but had evolved into active psychological warfare designed to break my resolve before the 72-hour deadline expired. I sat in the living room pretending to read a book, while my mother, Margaret, paced back and forth in the hallway with her cell phone pressed tightly against her ear. She was not merely having a private conversation, but was intentionally broadcasting her performance so that I would hear every single word of her fabricated sob story. Margaret called aunt after aunt and cousin after cousin to spin a horrific narrative where she was the victim of an ungrateful daughter who had lost her soul to greed. Her voice cracked theatrically as she told my Aunt Linda that I was throwing them out onto the freezing streets of Portland in the middle of a harsh winter without a penny to their names. I heard her sob into the receiver. I don't know what we did wrong to raise such a heartless child who cares more about her empty house than her own flesh and blood. It took every ounce of my self-control not to snatch the phone from her hand and scream the truth about their intrusion and entitlement into the receiver. Instead of engaging with her manipulative dramatics, I decided to check on my home office because I had an unsettling feeling that Roxanne had been too quiet all morning. My instincts proved to be painfully accurate when I walked into my workspace and noticed that the glass display case housing my designer handbag collection was slightly ajar. I approached the shelves with a sinking heart and pulled down a vintage leather tote that I had bought to celebrate my first big promotion years ago. At first glance, it looked fine, but when I ran my fingers over the leather, I felt the rough edges of a deep surgical slice that ran across the entire back panel. I frantically checked the other bags and discovered that every single one had been vandalized with tiny, precise razor cuts that destroyed their structural integrity and resale value. This was not a crime of passion or accidental damage. It was a calculated act of malice designed to hurt me where Roxanne knew it would sting the most. The realization that my sister hated me enough to destroy my hard-earned possessions purely out of spite extinguished the last lingering spark of guilt I felt about evicting them. I walked out of the office without saying a word to anyone and pulled out my smartphone to access the central control app for the entire property. If they wanted to play dirty games with my property, I would show them exactly who held the controls to the environment they were so desperate to occupy. I navigated to the network settings and immediately changed the Wi-Fi password to a random string of characters before remotely disabling the modem's power supply to ensure no one could reconnect. Then, I went to the Utilities tab and engaged the smart valve lock on the main hot water heater, effectively cutting off the supply to every shower and faucet in the house. A grim satisfaction settled in my chest as I imagined their reactions when the endless stream of digital entertainment and comforting hot showers suddenly vanished. Just as I finished locking down the house, I glanced out the front window and saw my father Victor standing on the sidewalk talking to Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood gossip who knew everyone's business. He was putting on an Oscar-worthy performance with slumped shoulders and a hanging head, while wiping fake tears from his eyes to garner her sympathy. I could see Mrs. Gable looking toward my house with an expression of disgust, clearly buying into whatever lie my father was feeding her about my cruelty. I opened the front door and marched down the walkway to confront them before his poison could spread any further through the neighborhood. I heard him say in a trembling voice, "We just don't know where to go because she has changed so much since she started making money, Mrs. Gable." I stepped right into their circle and cut off his pathetic monologue before he could utter another lie to damage my reputation. I looked directly at Mrs. Gable, who seemed ready to scold me, and then I turned my cold gaze back to my father. I pointed back at the house where my ruined belongings lay and delivered the truth with brutal clarity. They destroyed my property and refused to leave. Would you let someone who slashed your tires stay in your house? Mrs. Gable's jaw dropped as the color drained from my father's face because he never expected me to air our dirty laundry so publicly. The look in the neighbor's eyes shifted instantly from pity to suspicion as she took a step back from him. My father stammered for a moment but could not find a rebuttal, so he turned around and shuffled shamefully back toward the house, like a beaten dog. I stood on the lawn for a moment longer to ensure the message was clear, knowing that the social pressure was finally starting to turn in my favor. On the morning of the eviction deadline, a piercing scream echoed from the living room, shattering the early silence and freezing the blood in my veins. I dropped the coffee mug I was holding and sprinted down the stairs while fearing that something truly terrible had happened despite our conflict. When I reached the bottom landing, I found a chaotic scene that looked like it had been staged for a dramatic soap opera rather than real life. My father Victor was writhing on the living room rug, clutching his chest with both hands and gasping for air in exaggerated wheezes that filled the room. My mother was kneeling beside him with tears streaming down her face, but the moment she saw me, her expression shifted from concern to pure accusation. Margaret pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed that I was a murderer whose selfishness had finally pushed her poor husband into a fatal heart attack. I ignored her histrionics and immediately dialed emergency services because I could not take the risk of ignoring a potential medical emergency, even if my instinct screamed it was fake. The paramedics arrived within minutes and loaded Victor onto a stretcher while my mother continued to wail about how my eviction notice had literally broken his heart. I followed the ambulance to the hospital in my own car with a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach, because part of me was terrified that I was actually responsible. I spent 2 agonizing hours in the waiting room while doctors ran a battery of tests to determine the severity of his condition. Finally, a weary-looking physician emerged from the double doors and signaled for me to join him in a private corner of the hallway, away from my mother. He lowered his voice and informed me that my father's heart was perfectly healthy for a man of his age, and there was absolutely no sign of cardiac arrest. The doctor explained that Victor was suffering from severe acid reflux caused by a diet of greasy food combined with mild stress which mimicked chest pain, but was nowhere near life-threatening. A wave of relief washed over me, followed instantly by a surge of cold fury, because I realized they had orchestrated this entire event to manipulate me on the very day they were supposed to leave. I walked back to the room where my father was resting comfortably and found Margaret holding a discharge paper that she had strategically folded to hide the diagnosis. She looked up at me with fresh tears in her eyes and launched her final desperate attempt to stay in my house using his health as a shield. Margaret grabbed my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong and sobbed, "Your father needs care 24/7. How can you throw him out when he's dying?" I looked at the man lying in the hospital bed who refused to meet my gaze and realized that he was fully complicit in this emotional blackmail. I knew that if I forced them out now, they would tell everyone I abandoned a sick old man, but I also knew I could not let them win completely. I took a deep breath and decided to offer a compromise that would look generous to the outside world while actually tightening my control over them. I told my mother that they could return to my house for exactly 2 weeks to allow Victor to recover fully, but I had one non-negotiable condition. I leaned in close and told them that since the house needed to be quiet for his recovery, Roxanne was absolutely forbidden from setting foot on the property. My mother tried to protest that families should be together, but I cut her off by saying it was the only way they would have a roof over their heads, to ensure they followed my rules, and to prevent any further fake emergencies. I informed them that I would be hiring a private live-in nurse to assist with his care. I framed it as a luxury service for my ailing father, but in reality I was installing a professional witness who would report their every move to me. That afternoon I introduced them to Nurse Joy, a stern and highly efficient woman I had hired through a premium agency with specific instructions to monitor the household. Joy was not the warm and fuzzy caregiver they expected. She was a no-nonsense professional who immediately took charge of the living room and established a strict routine. She confiscated the unhealthy snacks my mother tried to sneak to Victor and began documenting his vitals and activities in a detailed logbook every single hour. My mother's plan to use this time to relax and sabotage me was instantly thwarted because she could not make a move without Joy writing it down. Nurse Joy became my eyes and ears inside the house, effectively turning their victory of staying into a period of supervised confinement. I went to bed that night feeling a strange sense of calm because even though they were still in my house, they were no longer in control. 3 days after my father returned home from the hospital, I received an urgent text message from Nurse Joy while I was in a client meeting. My phone buzzed aggressively against the mahogany conference table, and when I glanced down at the screen, I saw a blurry photo of my sister sitting on my living room sofa holding a wine glass. The accompanying message from Joy explained that my mother, Margaret, had secretly unlocked the back patio door to let Roxanne inside, while claiming to the nurse that my sister was merely delivering urgent heart medication for my father. I immediately realized that my mother had exploited Joy's professional compassion to bypass my strict ban on Roxanne entering the property, proving once again that their entitlement knew no boundaries. I offered a hasty apology to my bewildered clients before rushing out of the office and jumping into my car to race across the rain-slicked streets of Portland. My heart pounded against my ribs, not from fear, but from a burning indignation that they would dare to turn my home into a playground the moment I turned my back. When I pulled into the driveway, I could hear the thumping bass of music vibrating through the walls of my house, completely disregarding the fact that my father was supposedly recovering from a serious medical condition. I threw open the front door and walked into a nightmare where my pristine living room had been transformed into a chaotic dive bar filled with thick, gray smoke. Roxanne was lounging on the sofa surrounded by 3 strangers who looked like they had been dragged in from a street corner, and on the coffee table sat 3 empty bottles of my most expensive vintage Cabernet Sauvignon. The air was thick with the smell of cheap marijuana and spilled alcohol, and I watched in horror as one of Roxanne's friends ashed his cigarette directly onto my hardwood floor. Roxanne looked up with a glazed expression, clearly intoxicated, and instead of showing fear, she let out a loud, cackling laugh, as if my arrival was the punchline to a joke. One of the men, a disheveled guy with a neck tattoo, noticed me standing in the doorway and decided to mock the situation by raising my own crystal wine glass in a toast. He leaned back with a sloppy grin plastered on his face and slurred, "Why the long-faced landlord come grab a glass and join the party." I did not dignify his insolence with a response or even a flicker of emotion, because they were not worth the breath it would take to scream. I walked past them with purposeful strides straight to the utility panel located in the hallway closet, completely ignoring their jeers and catcalls. I opened the metal door of the breaker box and yanked the main lever down with a definitive clunk, instantly plunging the entire house into pitch-black darkness and silencing the music. The sudden sensory deprivation caused the group to scream in confusion, and I could hear them stumbling over furniture in their drunken stupor. I pulled out my smartphone and activated the flashlight, cutting a harsh beam of white light through the darkness that blinded them as I aimed it directly into their faces. I stood at the entrance of the living room like an avenging angel and delivered my ultimatum with a voice that tolerated no negotiation. I kept the light steady on the terrified stranger's face and declared, "Get out now, or I will call the police and charge every single one of you with trespassing." The threat of police involvement sobered them up instantly, and I watched as the three strangers scrambled over each other to escape through the front door into the rain. They did not even look back for Roxanne, who was left standing alone in the center of the trash-filled room, looking both humiliated and murderous. She glared at me with pure venom in her eyes before stomping out the back door, muttering curses under her breath about how I ruined everything. Nurse Joy emerged from the kitchen looking apologetic, but I assured her that this was not her fault before I turned my attention to the rest of the house. A sinking feeling in my gut told me that a party was not the only reason Roxanne had risked coming here while I was at work. I ran upstairs to my master bedroom and immediately noticed that the painting hiding my wall safe had been crookedly pushed aside. My hands trembled as I inspected the digital keypad and saw deep scratches around the panel where someone had used a tool to force the lock mechanism. I pulled the heavy door open, and my worst fears were confirmed when I saw that the emergency envelope containing $2,000 in cash was missing. My family had not just violated my home and my rules, they had crossed the final line from intruders to criminals, and this theft gave me exactly what I needed to end this forever. That evening, the silence in the house was heavier than lead, signaling an impending explosion that would destroy this family forever. I had asked Nurse Joy to wait in the kitchen for her own safety, because I knew that what I was about to do would likely provoke a dangerous reaction from the people sitting before me. I stood in front of the fireplace while my parents and Roxanne sat on the sofa with their arms crossed, looking more like annoyed teenagers than adults who had just committed a crime. I did not say a word as I walked over to the coffee table and placed my iPad down with deliberate slowness before pressing the play button on the video file. The screen illuminated the dim room with high-definition footage recorded earlier that afternoon by a motion-activated camera I had hidden inside a vintage teddy bear on the bookshelf. The video clearly showed Roxanne entering my bedroom using a screwdriver to pry open the digital panel of my wall safe and stuffing the thick envelope of emergency cash into her bra with a greedy smile. I watched their faces closely as the evidence played out, expecting at least a flicker of shame or embarrassment, now that their dishonesty had been exposed in undeniable 4K resolution. However, even with the incriminating footage playing right in front of her face, Roxanne immediately started screaming that the video was fake and manipulated by AI to frame her. My mother, Margaret, did not even look at the screen, but instead glared at me with pure hatred for daring to accuse her favorite child of being a common thief. She stood up to shield Roxanne from my accusatory gaze and shouted the most ridiculous justification I had ever heard. "She just borrowed it. You have plenty of money, why are you so stingy with your own sister?" That sentence was the final straw that severed the last microscopic thread of attachment I felt toward these people who claimed to be my family. I realized that in their twisted reality, my hard work existed solely to fund their laziness, and they would never respect my boundaries no matter how much proof I provided. I did not waste my breath arguing against their delusional logic, but instead walked over to the pile of Roxanne's belongings near the door. I grabbed the handle of her heavy suitcase and dragged it across the floor before heaving it out onto the rain-soaked driveway with all my strength. I pointed a trembling finger toward the open door and ordered her to get out of my life before I physically removed her myself. Roxanne snapped completely when she saw her clothes getting soaked in the mud, and she lunged at me with the ferocity of a wild animal. Her fingernails dug deep into the skin of my cheeks as she screamed incoherently and shoved me backward, with a force I did not know she possessed. I lost my balance on the slick hardwood floor and fell backward, crying out in pain as the back of my head collided hard against the sharp edge of the glass coffee table. Warm blood immediately began to trickle down my neck and onto my collar, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the horror of what happened next. I expected my parents to pull her off me or at least try to stop the violence, but instead I felt my father's rough hands pin my arms to the floor. My mother leaned over me with a twisted expression of satisfaction on her face and encouraged the assault instead of stopping it. She looked down at her bleeding daughter and screamed at Roxanne with chilling approval. "Teach her a lesson about respect." They were so caught up in their frenzy of violence that they did not hear the approaching sirens until the flashing blue lights illuminated the living room walls. I had dialed 911 and left the line open in my pocket the moment I walked into the room to ensure the operator heard every threat and scream. The front door burst open with a crash as 3 police officers stormed in with their weapons drawn, shouting commands for everyone to get on the ground immediately. The officers tackled Roxanne before she could land another blow and forcefully pulled my parents away from me while snapping handcuffs onto their wrists. I lay on the floor clutching my bleeding head and watched as the people who gave me life were dragged away in chains for their unforgivable betrayal. 3 weeks after the arrest, the dust had settled, but the legal battle was just beginning to reveal the true cost of their actions. I sat in the sterile courtroom next to my attorney Jessica and watched the judge's expression darken as he reviewed the high-definition security footage of the assault on the large monitor. The silence in the room was absolute as the video played the sickening audio of my mother encouraging Roxanne to beat me while my father pinned my arms to the floor. The judge paused the video on the frame where my head struck the table and looked down at the defendants with undeniable disgust before delivering his final verdict. He declared that their behavior was not merely a family dispute, but a coordinated criminal act of violence that required the court's strongest intervention to ensure my safety. The judge looked directly at Roxanne, who was trembling in her orange jumpsuit, and stated, "Based on the horrific nature of this assault, I am granting a permanent restraining order against the sister and a 5-year order for the parents." Although Roxanne was released on bail pending her criminal trial, she immediately proved that she possessed zero intelligence or remorse by taking her grievance to the internet. Instead of keeping a low profile as her public defender had undoubtedly advised, she launched a smear campaign on social media, claiming that I had fabricated the evidence and physically abused our elderly parents. I watched in disbelief as her tearful video garnered thousands of views from gullible strangers who commented that I was a monster for treating my family so poorly during a financial crisis. I knew I could not fight this digital war alone, so I reached out to my college friend Chloe, who worked as a digital media specialist and possessed the technical skills I needed to clear my name. Chloe arrived at my temporary hotel room with her laptop and immediately went to work synchronizing the raw security footage with the time-stamped audio from my 911 call. We did not edit out a single second of their cruelty because we wanted the world to see the unvarnished truth of what happened inside that house. Chloe hovered her finger over the enter key and looked at me with a serious expression to ensure I was ready for the fallout. She warned me, once we hit publish on this, there is no going back, but the world needs to see who they really are. I nodded my consent, and within hours of the video going live, the tide of public opinion shifted violently against my family as the internet descended upon them with righteous fury. The comment section under Roxanne's fake sob story filled up with thousands of angry messages calling them toxic parasites and demanding justice for the abuse I endured. Even the neighbors in Portland who had previously sided with my father saw the footage and realized they had been manipulated by a master liar. Mrs. Gable, the gossip who had judged me on the lawn, was reportedly telling everyone on the block that she was terrified to have ever associated with such violent people. With my reputation restored and my legal protection secured, I returned to the house one last time to meet with a real estate agent. Walking through the empty rooms felt like navigating a graveyard of bad memories where every corner held a ghost of their intrusion. I stopped in the living room and stared at the deep scratches on the hardwood floor where the glass table had slid during the struggle that nearly killed me. I realized that no amount of cleaning or renovating could ever scrub away the feeling of betrayal that seeped into the very foundation of this structure. I turned to the real estate agent, a sharp woman named Beverly, and told her that I did not care about getting the highest market price for the property. I handed her the keys with a steady hand and said, "Get this place sold as fast as possible because I never want to step foot in Portland again." We stood at the kitchen island where my mother had once demanded I cook for her, and I uncapped my pen to sign the listing agreement. As the ink dried on the paper, I felt a physical weight lift off my chest, as if the house itself had been holding me hostage. Selling this place was not just a financial transaction. It was the final severance of the cord that bound me to a past I was desperate to escape. 6 months had passed since I walked out of that house for the last time, leaving the ghosts of my past behind in the rainy city of Portland. I decided to relocate completely to the vibrant city of Seattle, where I purchased a stunning high-rise apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Puget Sound. The constant gray drizzle that used to depress me in Portland now felt cleansing against the glass of my new sanctuary, because I was finally free from the toxic weight that had anchored me down for 32 years. My career as a creative director flourished in this new environment, and I found myself closing deals and leading campaigns with a renewed energy that only comes from absolute mental freedom. I maintained a strict policy of zero contact with my biological relatives, but my lawyer, Jessica, kept me informed about their inevitable downfall during our scheduled monthly check-ins. During our last call, Jessica revealed with a hint of professional satisfaction that Roxanne had been sentenced to 3 years of probation and 400 hours of community service for her crimes. The felony conviction for assault and theft remained permanently on her record, which meant that no reputable company would hire her, forcing her to take a humiliating job washing dishes at a roadside diner just to pay her court fines. The most tragic part of the update was learning that my parents had suffered the ultimate betrayal at the hands of the golden child they had protected so fiercely. Jessica explained that Roxanne had secretly drained their entire retirement savings account to pay for her criminal defense lawyer because she refused to use a public defender. Without their financial cushion, my parents were forced to sell their beloved family home in the countryside at a loss and move into a subsidized social housing complex on the outskirts of town. The image of my arrogant mother living in a damp, moldy apartment surrounded by the squalor she used to mock gave me a grim sense of closure, knowing that karma had finally collected its debt. One rainy Tuesday evening, while I was enjoying a glass of vintage Pinot Noir on my balcony, my phone began to vibrate aggressively on the table with a call from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before sliding my finger across the screen to answer, and I was immediately greeted by the sound of jagged, desperate sobbing that I recognized instantly. My mother Margaret was weeping into the receiver with a broken voice that sounded nothing like the imperious woman who had once ordered me to cook her breakfast. She struggled to catch her breath as she explained that my father Victor was critically ill with a severe lung infection caused by the mold in their new apartment, and that they had no money left to buy his prescription antibiotics. She begged me to send them $500, swearing on her life that this was not a lie like the heart attack incident, and promising that they would never bother me again if I just helped them this one last time. I listened to her pleas with a detachment that surprised me, realizing that the scared little girl who used to crave her approval had died the day they held me down to be beaten. I took a slow sip of my wine and looked out at the glittering lights of the Seattle skyline while she continued to wail about family duty and forgiveness. I waited for her to pause for a breath, and then I delivered my final words to her with a voice as cold and unyielding as the ocean below. I spoke clearly into the microphone so there would be no misunderstanding. You chose your side, now live with it. I did not wait for her response before I ended the call and immediately blocked the number to ensure that their darkness could never penetrate my life again. I placed the phone face down on the table and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes to inhale the fresh, salty air of the Pacific Northwest. A genuine smile spread across my face because I finally understood that the greatest revenge was not inflicting pain upon them, but living a life so full of happiness and success that their existence no longer mattered. This story serves as a brutal reminder that sharing genetic material does not give anyone the license to abuse, manipulate, or disrespect you. Many people are conditioned to believe that they must endure toxicity simply because it comes from family, but Quinn's journey proves that cutting ties is sometimes the only way to survive. Setting boundaries is an act of profound self-respect, and when people react with anger to your boundaries, they are proving exactly why those walls are necessary. Finally, the story illustrates that the best revenge is never about retaliation or violence. It is about removing your energy from those who drain it and channeling it into your own success. Quinn's ultimate victory was not seeing her family suffer, but rather reaching a point where their suffering no longer had the power to affect her peace. Thank you so much for listening to this story until the very end, and I hope Quinn's strength inspires you to protect your own peace. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you think Quinn was too harsh in the end, or was her decision to cut them off completely necessary for her survival? Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice and resilience. See you in the next video.